Arcade Heroes.
Greetings, it's Adam with ArcadeHeroes.com, and one of my employees, Azriel, suggested this question for one of my upcoming videos, and figured that would be a good one to go with since I'm still waiting on some content for the game development video and still mulling over some ideas on others. But that is, what games have I sold over the years and why? When it comes to collecting and when it comes to getting games for business, it's a little bit different. Like, I actually don't have any games at my house. As when you have a business like this, it's like, well, why should I have this at my house when I can make money off of it? And with as expensive as they are, yeah, there's not much of a justifiable reason to have these at home. But of course, when you're collecting, you'll generally find games that you have some sort of emotional attachment to. But one thing that I learned owning games at home for some time before I did this was that I didn't play them a lot. And so I've seen plenty of people who have had something in their collection for many years, but eventually they do tire of it and want to swap it out for maybe something else that fits their fancy, or just need space because these things take up a lot of space. But the reasoning behind a lot of the arcade games is going to be, probably somewhat mundane. For the most part, the reason why you would get rid of a game at the arcade, probably the principal reason, is that it doesn't make enough money to earn its keep. Now, sometimes that may be down to it not covering its loan payments, like if it's something newer that's going to cost you, 5 digits of some sort. Probably not more, hopefully not more, but if it's a classic game, there are some classics out there which can cost over $1,000, but if they're only making $5 a week, do the math, that'll take a very, very long time for it to pay itself off. And so sometimes just opportunity knocks. As on occasion, I have had somebody come in and say, hey, you're selling this specific game, and I look at how it's doing, and it's like, well, yeah, I actually will sell this to you. And so I've done that on a few of the games that I'm going to mention for this list, and just get into that there. So I'll go over a lot of these and then get into specifics on ones that really, I guess maybe I regretted selling and whatnot, and I'll try and keep it snappy. Start off with Pinball Machines. And so when I first opened up business, I only had 2 pinball machines, a Shrek and an Indiana Jones by Stern, the 2008 one, not the 1993 Williams one that most people seem to enjoy the most. And so I did have those for many years, but eventually got to a point where I did sell them off. I do regret selling the Shrek one just because it's so rare. I think there's only something like 200 units that were ever produced, and it was, of course, the same design as Family Guy. But the reason why I sold that one off is it didn't really have much to do with the earnings, it was more to do with the maintenance. And with that one in particular, there were a few parts where the wear and tear on the playfield was getting to be a bit too much. As I recall, there was some playfield damage starting to come into. And so it was just one of those things where it's like, I'll take the money that I get from this and invest it into a new pinball machine. And that's what I did in both cases, or most of these cases that I sold a pinball machine. That's what I did. And the same thing with Indiana Jones. I liked the mechanic in that when the arc would open up and the balls would pop out for multi-ball. The only problem is that since they would fall onto the playfield, and it was around this magnet, it would cause playfield damage. And I had tried everything that I could think of, protectors and whatnot, and to fix that up and help it last, but it was just getting to a point where it's like, this should be in a collection instead of a public arcade, because it's just not holding up. And so that was why I sold that one off. Also, I traded off, well, 2 of the games on my list I traded off. There was an Atari Space Riders. Oh wait, no, sorry. I actually did sell that one. I traded off Doctor Who and Dialed In. I sold off Austin Powers recently, also traded off Stranger Things. And so Space Riders was also a maintenance thing. When it actually worked, it got played quite a bit for a game from the 70s. I was surprised how well it would do, but that's when it worked. It broke down a lot, and getting parts for an Atari pinball was often a little more difficult than the other ones, just because Atari didn't make a lot of pinballs, and so there's not as many repro parts for that. Doctor Who was also a maintenance nightmare, and so that's why I ended up trading that off for the space shuttle that you might have seen in one of my other videos. Austin Powers just wasn't a good performer, and I think that's because of there's a few Austin Powers in the area, and there's also a Family Guy here, so I think that just kind of competed against it. You might be wondering why I would have traded off Dialed In and Stranger Things, because both of those were very advanced games as far as technology goes for something. Those were the most advanced games on the market. Dialed In had things like a camera with motion sensing, it had Bluetooth capabilities, had little drones with the spinning blades, it had a holographic target, and so it was a very advanced machine. But that one came down in part to maintenance. I was surprised how often that one had some little issues here and there, or sometimes even major issues. Had to replace the hard drive on it, I think, twice. And but it also was the worst earning newer game that I had pinball machine that I had ever owned. And so usually new pinball machines all seem to make about the same amount of money, no matter what the theme is, at least for me. But that one, it just never performed very well, and it was also a limited edition, so it was a little pricier. But yeah, I attribute that, in that specific case, to not the lack of a license, but just to how the game handled its own theme. And as I mentioned in the pinball video, one problem with pinball and people approaching it is it's not very intuitive. If you've never played pinball before, then you don't really know what it is. And so yeah, you will go and probably play something else unless there's something about the theme or the license that stands out to you, then that can maybe draw you in enough to want to try it. But the problem with Dialed In is it just didn't make a lot of sense. Like when you would start the game and say, here's your new phone, and then all of a sudden you're hitting targets that have to do with electrical grids, and there's natural disasters going off, and there's monsters appearing in the holographic target. It just didn't explain itself at all. And so I think that for a lot of players, they're just like, this is strange and I don't really get it, because it just didn't tell its own story really to the player. And even though it had some narration, it just again didn't narrate the story. And it came with a comic book, and it even had some of that story explained in the attract mode, but nobody had access to the comic book. It wasn't something I was going to set on the machine because it would have disappeared mysteriously. But the attract mode also, just nobody watches that. And so it's something that needs to be integrated into the game. But even then, it was kind of odd. Even the comic book didn't fully seem to explain what all that was about. It had something to do with the phone having quantum powers or something that could cause events when it was being used. But it was strange how that was put out. And so I think that's why that one didn't do well. Stranger Things, again, both of these machines, I got them because I thought their technological innovations would help people want to play it more. And Stranger Things also had the name attached to it, but it also had some really cool projection mapping where it would project things on the targets, on certain targets. And that was really cool to see. Wasn't too crazy about having to buy the ultraviolet light kit, even though I already bought the premium version to do that, but I did it anyways. But all those things didn't help. It didn't, again, make much more money than like my Addams Family. It did make a little bit more, but just not enough. Now granted, that one was bad timing because I got it literally the week where lockdowns started all across the country, and so I wasn't able to even make any money at all for like a month and a half. And of course, when I opened, things were so dead that it just didn't get a super fair shake. But at least in the first part of 2021, where things around here were getting back to somewhat normal. It still just, again, wasn't doing hot, and somebody offered me a Mandalorian machine and the Austin Powers, and it's like, that seems like a good trade. Oh, plus a basketball machine. And so I took it, and I still kind of regret selling that one or trading that one off, but that's why I did it on those. But also, again, sometimes these things, especially with pinball, come down to maintenance. And as you'll see as I get into my list on video games, a lot of those will also be maintenance related. Now let me go down the list on the video games. This one's quite a bit longer. I tried to organize it by the earliest ones that I'd sold, but it's been a little difficult to keep track of that because I haven't written down when I sell these things off. But one of my first ones that I sold off was Mighty Pang. I just sold the PCB. There was T-Mek by Atari Games. That one I definitely regret selling. I'll get into that in a minute. Big Buck Safari, Terminator Salvation, Shinobi, RoadBlasters, Track and Field, the Konami one, of course. Captain America and the Avengers by Data East, BattleZone by Atari, Asteroids Deluxe by Atari, Zaxxon by Sega, Phoenix by Century, Area 51 by Atari Games, Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift, well, this was actually a trade to Supercars and then eventually Cruis'n. Sold off Cruis'n Exotica, sold off Skycurser by Griffin Aerotech, sold off X-Men, the 6-player model by Konami. So yeah, I'll get into why that one, I'm sure that's shocking. Joust by Midway, Lightning Knights by XR Arcadia, Daytona Championship USA by Sega, and Star Wars Battle Pod by Bandai Namco Amusements. So, why did I sell off some of those? And I'm sure some of the names are really surprising that I would have sold those off. Well, in most of those cases, it was because they just didn't earn their keep. The games that I probably regret the most selling would be T-Mek, as I loved that one growing up, and RoadBlasters to a degree, Terminator Salvation to a degree, X-Men as well, and Star Wars Battle Pod. There's some regret there, but at the same time, I can remember why I made these selling decisions. On T-Mek, part of it was maintenance. At the time where I sold it off, I didn't really know how to repair some of the components on it. Since then, I've learned, and so if I had it now, then I probably would have kept it around. But the other problem too was just that thing was massive. And I moved from my first spot, where I had more space, into a more cramped spot. And that's where it just became like, I can't really fit anything else in here. And this one's got some problems, it's not doing well, so I'll sell it off. I can't remember how much I sold it for, but I got it for free, so I couldn't complain too much. But Big Buck Safari was actually a trade for Big Buck HD down the road. Same thing with Terminator Salvation. I traded it for Aliens, which you can sort of see in the darkness over here. And that one was, or that one, as well as trading for Cruis'n. In those situations, it was, well, the game I'm replacing it with is similar enough. It was by Raw Thrills in both instances, or also even with Big Buck, and figured, getting the newer version, it shouldn't earn less. If at its worst, it should earn the same amount as what this one is currently doing. But in all cases, they ended up earning better, so they were all a good decision to do. And like Aliens is still usually in my top 5 or 8 or somewhere around there, definitely in the top 10 every year. Games like RoadBlasters, Track and Field, Captain America, Phoenix, Joust, Skycurser, they just all didn't earn well, and that just came down to, well, I spent this much money on it. It's already been a few years that I've had these games, except for Joust. I think I only had that about a year, but it only made like $5 a week on average. And so for as much as the game cost me, it was like $700-800. Just that name wasn't pulling people in. Same with Track and Field. Although Track and Field, I did have the unusual trackball version instead of the button version. RoadBlasters, as I recall, it had a couple of little issues on the controls, but I was able to fix them. But again, it wasn't going to make a lot more money. except for when Wreck-It Ralph came out. That's when it would get a little bit of a boost as people recognized it, but other than that, it also just didn't do well. Captain America also just never did well, no matter what. BattleZone and Asteroids Deluxe, yeah, I do in some ways regret selling those. I love vector games. I love that look that they have, which is very distinctive, that even on an LCD and emulation, it doesn't get it right. And they started having a lot of problems, and it's actually fits in with a major plot point for Wreck-It Ralph 2. And if any of you have seen that, remember that. I guess if you haven't, this might be a spoiler. But at the beginning of the movie, one of the popular games, Sugar Rush, or not so popular, I guess, Sugar Rush, the steering wheel on it breaks. And when the arcade operator goes to eBay or whatever Disney equivalent it was there, the cost of a replacement steering wheel was more than what the game made in an entire year. And I actually remember laughing out loud at that, and I was the only person in the theater who did, because, you know, I'm not sure how many arcade operators were really out there, but could really feel that pain and understand that, gosh, yeah, I've been there many times. And BattleZone and Asteroids Deluxe both fit that bill, unfortunately. And it's with Asteroids in particular, I remember some component in the monitor went down, and it took me 6 months to find this replacement part. And this was before the pandemic and those sorts of issues and finding parts. And when I did get it, it was over $100, and the game almost never made $100 in a year. And so after I did get that and fixed it up, that's where it's like, I'll sell it off, and there was somebody interested. And same thing with BattleZone. One that I also forgot to mention on the list was 1942. So 1942 and Zaxxon were the very first games that I ever picked up. Bought them off some guy in Salt Lake City when he posted a newspaper classified ad, which they used to do. And so there was I guess a little emotional connection there, them being my first games, and I did have them both in my arcade for many years, but yeah, just both of them didn't do terribly well. 1942 was in a Pengo cabinet, and so that caught the eye of a collector who was like, I really want that, I want to turn it back into a Pengo, and he offered a good price, and so that's where I was like, fine, I'll go with that. Zaxxon, it just, $50-$60 a year. Yeah, it made its money back, because I think I only got it for like $75 back in 2000. But still, it was just kind of filler and probably used up more electricity than it brought in cash. And kind of the same thing with Phoenix. That was also an early one. Cruis'n Exotica, I did expect this one to do a little bit better, but the main reason why it didn't earn well is because it had so many technical issues. I sent both of the computer boards in for that for repair. I had to repair both monitors. There was other issues with the controls and sometimes with the networking, and so that one was just a real headache. And so somebody contacted me at the right time and said, hey, I really want to get some Cruis'n Exoticas because I already have 2 of them. I want to have a network of 4. It's like, sure. I was disappointed in, just mainly due to the maintenance issues. And of course, that's one reason why some games won't earn, is because if they're broken down all the time, if you ever go into an arcade and you put your money into something and then one of the controls don't work, well, then you're not going to keep playing that, and it gives you a bad memory, bad taste in your mouth about that. I mentioned also Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift and Supercars, and so originally I got a pair of Cruis'n World cabinets back when I first opened in 2008 and converted those over to Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift, as there was a kit available to do that at the time. And it did fine for quite a long time, but then they offered the same thing a few years later with Fast and Furious Supercars, and to me it's like, hey, that's a no-brainer, that'll earn better, especially with the kit the way they did it. But then when Cruis'n Blast came along a few years down the road after that, it was like, well, even though these are brand new cabinets, they're a lot more expensive than, say, a conversion kit. They're going to look a lot nicer and should last a lot longer than these things which I've been just running through the mill over and over again. And so that was a good choice on my part, as Cruis'n Blast, as I've mentioned in some other videos, has been my #1 machine, and most weeks, not all week. Then there was Skycurser. This one might be a little surprising because I like to support indie developers, but I think the reason why this one didn't do well, as I remember, it was making like $5 to $7 a week, and the thing cost like $700. It was a conversion kit, but when I first got it, I think in 2015, the software was very early, and I think that was the mistake, is I got it too early, and so people that came in curious about it only played it that one time, didn't like what they played, and so they never came back to it again. And a few years later, Griffin Aerotech, the developers, did roll out more changes, improvements, more levels, and whatnot. And so when I sold it off, it was a much better game, and I tried to promote that on my social media, but just a lot of people seem to already have their opinions made up, and so they didn't come back for it again. And so, to be fair to the game, I heard some earnings in Japan back in the day that it was making like $250 a week. So if I was in Japan, then it would have done just fine, even with the beta software. But I sold that to Wilcox Arcade out in Tennessee. I'm not sure what he's done with it now, but hopefully that's done well for him in his situation. I mentioned Lightning Nights. That one I kind of sold off because I wanted to help out a fellow operator who picked up an Exa and he wanted some content, and it's like, well, this one for me wasn't doing the hottest, and so I decided to sell that off to him. At the time, I hadn't been planning on getting a 4-player Exa cabinet, and that's up to a 4-player game. I kind of wish I would have kept it now, just because, you know, now I would have one of those 4-player games for it, but oh well. Daytona Championship USA was just more of an opportunity. When I was at IAPA last year, there was an operator who really needed some racing games, and I mean, Daytona was earning fine, as I recall, something 200 to 300 coins a week per machine. Did have a few technical issues, but Sega was always very helpful in getting those fixed. But Maximum Tune 5DX Plus was right on the horizon, and I needed some money for that. So by selling Daytona, I was able to get that upgrade kit, and so it worked out for me in the end there. Of course, Daytona would have earned better if I had not bought a conversion kit version, which had been converted from Showdown over to Daytona. If I had some proper dedicated Daytonas, then I'm sure it would have done even better. But lesson learned. So a couple on the list that may have shocked you were X-Men, the 6-player version, and the Star Wars Battle Pod. Now, did they earn? Not really, not for how much they cost. Now granted, X-Men I had traded. I used to have this thing called Movie Stop where you would play a game to try and win actual DVDs out of it. And I remember had some operator up in Washington say, hey, I want a Movie Stop, I have this X-Men, would you take a trade for it? And it's like, yeah, sure. The only problem is that the X-Men one, kind of like T-Mek, it was massive. It was very difficult to move around and somewhat dangerous, really, just because of how heavy the monitor side was with 2 CRT2 monitors and all that wood. The control panel was fine to move around because it actually had wheels and all that, but yeah, that monitor portion was a nightmare, and it did operate fine for years. It's just, it would only make like $5 to $8 a week, and so when I read about people talking about the X-Men 6-player out there, it almost has this mythical status behind it, but at a location, kind of like I talked about in my retro arcade games video, it just didn't pull in. Now, there was certainly some indirect income there, and that's probably where I feel some regret on selling it, but it was also having some issues in keeping both of those tube monitors going. It was always very difficult to get the image quality to look the same between the pair of them. You know, sometimes that disparity in monitor quality might have hurt it too. But again, it just didn't make enough, and I had somebody kind of wear me down on wanting to really get that for his house, and gave me a good offer, and so I eventually relented. I didn't at first though. For a while I was like, nah, I'm gonna hold on to this, but yeah, eventually I gave in. I guess you can wear us arcade operators down if you try hard enough. And then Star Wars Battle Pod, that might be the most surprising one. That's one of the newest games that I've sold off. But the problem with that one, it was a big name, big game, very impressive cabinet, very unusual cabinet. That was the coolest thing about it. Dome screen, wind effects, all that surround experience. It was almost like wearing a VR headset, but without wearing a VR headset, if that makes sense. And it had that name to it, but it was also the biggest priced game that I ever owned, over $35,000, to give you an idea how expensive that game was when it first came out. But I decided I was gonna get a loan and strike while the iron was hot. I was something like $700 a month payments. And for the first few years, it actually did make enough to cover its monthly payments. And that's kind of what you want in a business situation. But of course, you want it to do better than just making those payments and make enough to pay it off early and then make a profit. But after The Last Jedi came out, all my Star Wars games, the Battle Pod, one of the pinball machines that I had, the Star Wars Trilogy Arcade, they just all started to go down. And I don't know if it was just Star Wars fatigue or something, but because none of the games that I had anything to do with the Disney stuff, but it was a noticeable drop, and Star Wars Battle Pod never recovered, and so it stopped making enough to cover its monthly payments, and that went on for a few years. It would do a little better around December when they would release a new Star Wars movie. I think I can't remember exactly when Solo came out, and of course there was Rise of Skywalker and all that, and those gave it little boosts, but again, after those passed, it just went back to, again, not really making much. And that one, I attribute the reason why to the game design. I always had a little bit of a problem with a couple of the design decisions on that one, as if you finished a level and you were victorious, you could either be victorious or you would fail. It didn't matter. If you were victorious, it didn't give you a free game into the next level. You had to pay again, and I think that turned off some players. If it was a failure, I could understand, charging for that, but still, it was kind of silly that it did that. And then also, it had a scoring system, but yet the only time you would ever see your score is after a game, if you stuck around. Sometimes players don't even stick around to put their initials in, but it would never show the leaderboards during the attract mode. And to me, I don't get why a lot of arcade games have done that. It's not just Star Wars that's committed this sin. Luigi's Mansion Arcade does the same thing. I believe Tomb Raider does. I heard Elevator Action Invasion did that too. And for arcade manufacturers, if there's any developers out there, what are you doing when it comes to leaderboards? I don't understand this. This is something, we've been around for 50 years. This should be basic game design, a standard game design of showing a leaderboard and using that to incentivize replay. So what's the point in having a score at all if the player can't even see what their score really is, or they can't come back to it and show it off? And so yeah, that's a little rant, I guess, on the side, but Star Wars was guilty of that. And also another annoyance, minor annoyance, was that the game came with a camera, but it didn't use it unless you bought 2 units. So you're like $70,000 in at that point, just to use a feature that should have been activated from the get-go. And Namco has always done this thing with having those little avatars like in Tank 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 or in Mario Kart, and for some reason Star Wars didn't implement that, and it should have. And so that was a big disappointment. I think with just some of those little things, maybe throwing in a bonus round in between levels, it could have helped it have more replay value. But in part, I understand it felt more like it was made for Dave & Buster's, where to me it seems like the idea is to get people in and out as quickly as possible, kind of like a redemption game. So yeah, that would be my best guess as to why. But interestingly enough, even now I've still had people pop up and say, hey, what happened to your Star Wars game? It was so cool. I came in all the time and played it. Now, granted, I haven't recognized most of these people that say that, but I can't remember, I guess, everybody that comes in. But still, it's like, well, if you really did come in and play it all the time, then I probably wouldn't have sold it because it would have made enough to justify that. And so, maybe I would pick one up again if I found one at a really, really good used price. But who knows? In a way, I would have preferred something like the software of Star Wars Trilogy Arcade in there, or maybe a remaster of what's that one from Namco called? Starblade. Don't know why I blanked out on that one for a moment, but Starblade would have been really cool in there. In fact, worthless trivia, I know this is already taking too long, is that Namco's dome screen technology was originally developed for Starblade 2. But that was never released. It was just kind of an experimental thing. Anyways, those are the games that I've sold over the years, and there's some extra reasons why, but if you're curious about any of them that I mentioned as to why I sold those off and I didn't get into detail on it, feel free to ask in the comments and then I can get into it there. I guess I should also mention I had a Super Shot basketball machine which I junked. I didn't sell that off because it had a massive mechanical failure and it was irreparable, and so I just had to bust most of that into pieces and sell it off, although I think there's still a few parts I need to sell off anyways. But are there any games you've ever sold off? Anything you regret selling? Why did you sell your games off? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching. We'll catch you on the next video.